The snow burned away toward noon, leaving tatters of white clinging to the peat hummocks like the last foam on a black shore. Eddard Stark took the steps of the drum tower one at a time, his injured leg complaining at each rise, until he came onto the ring walk where the wind ran free. The bog stretched vast and lonesome, a world of brown water and glimmering green, broken by crooked alders and the teeth of old stones. Reed men moved out there, half seen. A ripple like a fish's back, the quick wink of an oiled leather cap rising from a pool, then gone again beneath cattails. Howland had said, with the shadow of a smile, that the Neck did not admit strangers. It swallowed them. Ned had believed him even before he watched a Lannister scout party wander off a plank road and vanish without raising so much as a cry. A raven croaked on the parapet, stamping feet clawed and scaly, head cocked as if the bird had more to tell than its parchment carried. Ned unbound the thong and unrolled the tight scroll with fingers stiff from cold. His name was not in the salutation. Instead, Catelyn's hand bled through at once. Sturdy, controlled even when it trembled. I have reached Bitterbridge. Renly has crowned himself in a field of roses. The Reach stands with him. He laughs easily, speaks like a summer wind, and believes the realm will settle if only it sees his banner. I have asked him to treat with you and with Stannis. His answer was a feast and a promise and neither. There is a girl named Brienne, a knight of Tarth, taller than Hodder and twice as steadfast. She believes in him as a hearth fire believes in dry kindling. I do not, but I will try again. Do not spend Robb's blood where words might by the same ground. Kish Arya. Pray for Sansa. The ink had blotted at Sansa's name. Ned folded the letter back into its ribbon and leaned his palms on cold stone. The Neck breathed, and with it his breath steadied. He felt the old gods in the wind. No faces carved nearby, no bleached heartwood, but something older than both men and their vows. The patience of water eating stone, the slow hand that set peat to swallow ash and iron alike. War had always ended here in sucking mud, in yellow reeds where banners went to rot. If he held the moat, the north would be a hard nut for any southern hammer. If he held the moat and the rivers, and if his letters did what steel could not, perhaps the fever of the realm would break before the winter did. Hooves clattered on the cobbled court below, splashes loud in puddles. He watched a Crannog skiff slide under the shadow of the west tower, two reedmen poling it silently with long stakes that felt bottom through black water. Between them sat a rider with a cloak the color of wet salt. When she stepped ashore, Arya trotted beside her and threw her arms around Ned's waist before he could do more than brace. She found the path without getting lost, Arya announced, fiercely proud of a thing none but a child of the Neck could do at first trying. She is not meant to sink, the reed woman said mildly, the cadence of her tongue like marsh wind over stones. Water knows her shape. She was Howland's sister by her eyes and the way she stood, weight in the balls of her feet as if a sudden current might tug at any moment. Mira called me, she added. I am Willa of Greywater. Ned counted back through names he had not allowed himself to say aloud in years, found the girl who had grown into the spare woman, and felt a foolish rush of relief that one more thread to the past still held. They ate together on a plank laid over trestles in a chamber that stank of smoke and old moss. Frogs sang in the dusk outside, tireless. Willa told of raiding longships cutting like teeth along the stony shore, of fisherfolk vanishing, of ravens butchered mid-flight by darts from masts that had no device but salt. A kraken unfurls, she said, dipping a crust into stew and not eating it. Aaron Damphair comes up out of the sea and calls men from hearth and hall. On pike they ring a hammer on the sea-stone chair until barnacles crack. Ned set his trencher aside. My son sent Theon with warning, and to gauge Balon Greyjoy's intent. Willa's lips tightened. A boy may know his father's voice and yet not its words. Arya bristled. Theon is not a boy. Theon is many things, Willa said, non-committal. Salt takes what it will. He dismissed Arya to her pallet with a look, and when the marsh woman had gone, he sat alone in the hush, counting the beats of his heart. Theon had been a ward in Winterfell Stones since he had long hair for Catelyn's combs. The boy's laugh, his bright arrogance, his eagerness that covered a core he rarely named. Ned knew all that as he knew the buckles on his harness. But a father's pull was a deep tide. If Balan raised sails against the north, the choice would drown Theon one way or the other. By morning the mist lay heavy as wool, beating the men's cloaks and dripping from nostrils of horses who stamped and shook themselves as though to fling off a net. A horn's low call throbbed through the muck. Reed men appeared from nowhere, silent, wary. Howland Reed rose from a clump of rushes, water sluicing down oiled leather like rain off slate. He came up the steps with a frog spear slung and knelt in the old style without flourish, putting hands in Ned's. "Your letters swim where fish make roads," he said without preamble. "Stannis Baratheon covers the narrow sea with sails. His ravens carry a truth the South has no stomach to name. Renly Baratheon makes feasts from it. Tywin retreats to black stone that remembers dragon fire. And on Pike, the drowned and the undrowned draw lots for your coast." Ned's mouth went dry. "And Theon? He stands in a hall that stinks of sea and old rage," Reed said. "He hears a father's voice that is not a father's hand." The Cranaglord's eyes, reed brown and depthless, met Ned's. "If he lives through love and shame, he will be a sharper blade than he ever was for laughter alone." Theon slept beneath a roof that moaned like a sail, while wind pressed salt through every chink and seam. He woke to the thud of waves and the smell of lamp oil, sat up in a straw pallet in a chamber hung with fishing nets and armored by rust. He had ridden into Pike beneath iron spikes and corroded chains, under ravens stitching black across a slate sky. The path had been narrow as a knife's spine, long drops on either side whited by foam. He thought he could hear Ned Stark's voice even over the sea. "Learn the ground before you leave a track on it," and then had been ushered into a hall that was all shadows and lived salt. Balon Greyjoy sat hunched on his throne, the color of drowned bone, face lined like a map of reefs. His cloak dragged damp across the steps, leaving the pattern of a tide behind him. He did not stand. "Boy," he said, and strips of his voice snapped off and fell to the rushes. Theon made himself smile. "Father." He crossed the distance like a man walking a yard of ice. He knelt. Balon's hand smelled of tar and rust and old fish when it closed on Theon's hair, clamped, and shook slow as a lash. "I took a son to force the wolf to heel," he said. "They fattened him on bread and false honor. And now he brings me, what?" He spread fingers. "A letter asking fealty?" Theon held himself still. Asha, or whatever name the islanders used for her, lounged in a chair a few paces off, boots up on a chest, sea knife idly carving curls from a piece of driftwood. She watched the men with eyes that matched the water beyond. Gray when you wished for blue, blue when you prayed for gray. Aaron Damphair stood behind the throne with hair like seaweed and skin the color of drowned memory. "The drowned god demands salt and storm," the priest intoned. "The hoarfrost of the green men is an affront." Theon tried to answer what lies would be believed, and found none of them sat comfortably on his tongue. So he told the truth, and the truth tasted like iron. "Robb Stark is one I would follow until my bones are grit in a wolf's teeth," he said. "And I will follow him, unless my father gives me a deck under my boots and ripe coasts under my prow." Asha laughed low, delighted, not mocking. Balon's nostrils flared. "Words," he said. "You come ashore with your mouth full. Show me what your hands can take." He jerked his chin toward a crude map carved into the table with the point of a blade. "I will have Moat Cailin." Theon stared before he could school it. "You cannot march on peat," he said. "You cannot sail it either." "Then raid," Balon snapped. "Skin the north along its left ribs. Deepwood, the Cape of Eagles, torches on white knife. Strike so the wolf pulls his pack away from lion fields." Asha's knife halted. "And you will put the boy in command of what?" 5 ships, Balon said. 8, 10. Enough to take what he can and drown if he cannot. He leaned back, cloak creaking. "Take the wolf's shore. Take a daughter's hand in either fist if you must." Theon heard what he meant. He thought of Sansa's letter and swallowed. "I am no thief of girls." "You are no son of mine," Balan said, not loudly, and each word fell into Theon's chest and turned there to stone. Aaron murmured the drowned god's prayer. Asha flicked wood shavings into a candle's honest flame and smiled at her brother like a riddle he had not yet solved. Theon fled the hall for the wind and stood on a parapet where salt stung his eyes to tears he refused. The sea threw its shoulders against the rock. Spray clothed him in a ghost's mantle. From here, what Balan asked seemed simple. Strike where wool and pine and fish lay fat, drag fire through it, be a trueborn son at last turn knife. And yet, in the marrow of him, Ned Stark's voice held like a nail through a plank. Winterfell had taught him laughter, but it had also taught him the worth of a promise and the shape of shame. He held his head in both hands and pictured two futures like roads across frost. Both ended in snow, but one stank of burned barns and children's screams. He did not know if he could live beneath that smell even if his father called it brine. He slept a little, and in the night a gull cried that sounded enough like Arya's laugh. He woke cursing and wept because it was a bird. By dawn he had a plan pinned under his tongue like a smuggled coin. Asha came to him with oilskin and a bottle of something that could scour rust from chainmail. "You will not drown," she said, inspecting him like a craftsman inspects a tool. "If you go, if..." She twirled the bottle by its neck, then caught it again. "I played that game once. Father did not teach either of us the rules. Perhaps the rules are the sea's and no man's," Theon said, which surprised himself. It surprised Asha too. She looked at him anew. "Bring no wolves to Pike," she said at last. "If you choose them, do not make me kill you." "I should say the same," he said, and it made them both smile a little sadly. On that same dawn, the southern sky over Bitterbridge was the color of bruised peaches, and Renly Baratheon's camp moved through it like a festival that had learned to put on steel. Pennants embroidered with golden roses snapped from spears. Cooks laughed. Men sang explicit songs about Marjorie's hair and Loras's lance while their boots were polished to a king's mirror shine. Renly himself sat upon a horse so glossy it reflected the clouds. A rose-wreathed crown circled his dusk hair like it belonged there. He received Catelyn in a pavilion whose silk walls were panels of spring. Green to the horizon, lambs and daisies stitched with pearls. He took her hands and pressed them sincerely and spoke her name as if it were sweet water after a salt march. When she asked him again to truly treat, with Stannis and the North, he poured her wine and smiled and talked of banners and of how some kings are the kind men die for gladly because they are glad to live under such kings. "Stannis is iron and rust," he said. "I am the better metal. When I am seated, I will make fair cause with your Robb. He can be warden and call himself what else he likes. King in snow, king in pines." His teeth flashed. "No need for two kings, lady. Men are tired of kings." "Men seem to be making more," Catelyn said, perhaps more sharply than she meant, and he laughed again. And for a heartbeat she wanted to like him because his laughter was warm and honest with himself. But she pictured Ned's leg wrapped and drained by leached blood, and Renly's silks turned to threads by winter wind, and her mouth had no room in it for the kind of bargain song he wanted sung. Brienne stood like a tower of sky beside the king's chair. When Catelyn met her eyes, she found in them not devotion merely, but the relief of a woman who had been told again and again that her strength was a cruelty and then found a place where it was a grace. "He is the king I chose," Brienne said simply, when Marjorie's ladies withdrew and the air had shifted. "There are worse measures." "There are other measures," Catelyn murmured, "and other kings." Brienne's jaw set almost imperceptibly. "There is him." That night, Catelyn wrapped her cloak tightly against the perfumed air and wrote to Ned that a summer king had flowered in a field of roses and that summer died in all the songs as surely as it died in the hills. She asked Arya to keep needle-oiled even in the south of her world. She asked Robb to break where needed and never mistakes the breaking for failure. She asked the gods to grant her one letter she had never had, addressed to Sansa and brought home to a hand she could touch. In King's Landing, the wind off the Blackwater made carrion of all perfumes. Seagulls screamed and fought over rotting cod guts, and the Goldcloaks who watched them did not laugh because they were hungry too. Tyrion Lannister entered through the river gate in a litter that had seen better paint. He shoved the curtain aside with a glove and breathed in the stink as though it were the purest jest he'd heard all week. "The city smells of victory," he quipped to Bronn, and Bronn snorted. "Smells of fish and pox," he said, but his hand never left the dagger hilt at his hip. Cersei received her brother in a carved chair beneath the seven-pointed star of the audience hall with her boy perched like a little hawk on a carved arm. Joffrey kicked his heels. The points of his shoes were in fashion that season, needle-sharp, toe like a tongue. "Our father sends you as his mouth," Cersei said. "I have never found you hard to swallow." Tyrion bowed, and when he looked up his mismatched eyes were lambent with mirth, with something else beneath that he left for her to name or not. "Father sends me as his hand," he said, producing the badge with a flourish. "Or possibly he sends me because even a dwarf is taller than the fools in your council." The slap never landed because he was not that stupid, but it hung in the air between them like an unsheathed blade. Littlefinger smiled where he stood like shadow turned silk. Varys's hands fluttered as if he might clap or might simply warm them, and Pycelle remembered his hair and forgot his words. "Grandfather sent a letter," Joffrey announced, bored with not being called king. "It said a wolf made soup out of Uncle Jaime." His eyes glittered. Cersei's fingers dug into the lion heads carved under her hands. "You will find the city tense," she told Tyrion, calmly while hatred smoked. "And you will keep it tight without breaking it. That is what hands are for." By midnight that same day Tyrion sat with a cup of wine he had watered more than custom, watching firelight ripple across the ceiling of a room he borrowed from a lord whose name he had already traded. He thought of Jaime in a Stark cell, and of Tywin behind black stone, and for a little while he let the smile go out of his face. Then he put it on again like a well-sewn coat, and called for parchment. He wrote to his sister about bread and onions and flint and the need for honest coin. He wrote to Littlefinger about loans that were not loans, and about sums the Iron Bank would forgive if a certain galleass should sink in deep water near a named shoal. He wrote to Varys about a boy who had the wrong father and about the way rumors spread like lice. Faster than fire, slower than truth. He sent a girl with hair the color of fresh straw to sing on a corner where the butchers drank on their feet, with new lyrics set to an old tune. It was a song about the wolves having teeth, and about how teeth sometimes smiled. By dawn, a gang of fishwives picked it up, and by noon it had changed verses twice, and the small folk were humming it without knowing who had taught them or why. Harrenhal squatted upon the shore of the God's Eye, a carcass of a castle that dragons had burned to a shape fire itself might fear. Robb Stark camped northeast of its shadow, not within bowshot but close enough that the black ruins towers seemed to lean in his sleep. Crows ringed them like forgotten crowns. Bolton's men went about as if the ruin were a church, Greatjans as if it were a privy. The woods around were full of deadfall and old tragedy. Robb paced amongst it like a wolf on a chain, sending teeth into foragers and drawing the lion out by inches whenever his horses were fresh. He slept little, and when he slept he dreamed of wheat turned to ice. Grey Wind was the more restless of the two, often gone from the edge of the camp circle and returning with burrs in his fur and the blood of something in his jowls. When the beast slept he twitched and whined, and Robb put a hand between the shoulders and felt the iron desire to run until the world went smaller. Messages from Riverrun were a belt across his waist. He tightened and loosened and tightened again each hour. Mother had left Renly with promises that had the weight of a feather on wet wool. Mother said she would go next to Storm's End and speak Stannis' iron. Robb was trying to hear the sound of that iron and not hear Theon's bright, loose voice at all. He did not notice how often he found Roose Bolton standing under trees as if the man grew there, or perhaps he did and his mind filed it as it filed the shape of a rock he might ride around tomorrow, and in riding around it not see much of it at all. At Moat Cailin the sky cleared to a brightness that had no heat. Ned trained with Ser Roderick until his leg buckled, and then trained his mind against the sting in its shadow. He had letters enough to numb a monk. The Vale's reply came curt and cold. Lisa would not march. The Eyrie was a mother's castle. The mountain passes would not be trod by men in steel while her son had breath to be protected. The seal was smeared, as if little Robin's hands had fidgeted at it. Ned put the letter in a box with the other sadnesses he could not change. A second raven came from White Harbor with insulting swiftness. Sails all along the left-hand coasts. Raiders bold enough to throw torches at the outbuildings of noble holds from a distance and row laughing when a boy ran out to chase them with a shovel. Ned sent back instructions by 6 different routes and gripped the parapet until his knuckles were pale as river ice. He could smell the iron in his own blood where a scab had cracked along his palm. He had not noticed when he had clenched his fist that hard. Theon lit lamps along the deck with hands that still shook. They had given him 8 ships and men whose eyes watched him the way cats watched a pit at its edge. Asha stood on the pier and did not wave farewell. Aaron raised both arms and the wind hissed through the hair that hung from them like kelp. "What is dead may never die," the priest cried, and the men banged spear on plank and echoed him, and Theon managed it too through clenched teeth. Then he gave the oars, and the ships moved like beasts that felt a pull in their ribs. They took 3 fish, Angie hamlets that had not much to take, and 2 watchtowers whose flags came down when a boy saw the number of their prow lamps. The Ironborn sang. They always sang when the wind filled their lungs and there were small fires behind them in the dark. Theon did not sing. He stood at the prow and watched would go from golden to black and then to a smell you tasted in your sleep. At night he unlocked a box, and in the box lay a lark-bone whistle Arya had carved once and given him because he could make it trill like a thrush and she could not. His hands turned it while his mind measured the line of the coast in the dark. He blew once, soft, so that only he heard it. A sailor turned and squinted. Theon put the bone away. On the 4th raid, he cut 3 men's throats and 1 woman's because she had a kitchen knife in her hand. He knelt beside a little boy afterward, a sky-blue thread still stuck on the point of his fine iron-bought boot. The boy had hair that looked like sweet hay and could have been any boy anywhere if the world were not what it was. Theon closed his eyes and saw Winterfell stone and Bran's legs that would not move. He stood up and was sick off the pier into water that would not notice what new thing it had to digest. When dawn made the sea pity-colored, Theon took his ships north instead of south. He stood at the tiller and set his mouth to a shape no one read until it was too late to turn the prow elsewhere. A rower with scars like maps across his shoulders noticed first, and by then the wind had the sails by their throats. A man went for the belaying pin rack and Theon drew his cutlass without thinking and knocked the man into the path of the swing, and so the man had no hand to grip with. After that, no one called any more names louder than a hiss. Theon did not go to the bow to watch the coast run by like a face turned away. He knew it. He held the tiller and whispered by habit to it, even though it was not a boy's pony and would not know his voice. By evening the horizon wore a smear of black stone and ghost towers. By full night the torches along the plank roads of the neck made a chain of fire that only someone who had walked it would trust. Theon lowered sails and raised the reed pennants he had hidden since Pike. Men looked back at him as if they were hope. Theon looked toward the moat and could not tell if he was saved or damned. Felt like both. Ned met him in the gray yard because he always did at Winterfell and had not the habit of unlearning that when he did not need to. Theon went to his knees all the way past civility. "If you mean to kill me, my lord," he said, voice flayed down to rope, "you should hear the sense of me before you do it." Arya was there because no one could keep her from any room where the smell of a story had been. She stood with fists in her jerkin and her chin a little up and her eyes hot with something Theon did not deserve. Ser Roderick Castle moved with a speed outrageous for a man with whiskers that white and beard that heavy. His sword lay across his arm like a silent promise. Ned limped to a halt in front of a boy who had grown into a man and then had found that all his growing did not change the shape of his heart. He did not touch Theon. "Stand up," he said. Theon stood. He told what he had done. He did not tell all of it, and he knew Ned would hear the emptinesses between the words as if they were their own words. When he came to the part about turning north, he did not use any word that made himself the hero because that would be a coin thrown onto a table that did not allow tips. Ned listened, face the color of old iron. When Theon was done, his throat had nothing left to swallow. "What is dead may never die," Arya said softly, and Theon almost laughed because she made it sound like a child's promise used to get a cat out from under a table. Ned's eyes were winter clear. "You will get me the shape of your father's wrath," he said. "You will put me in a place where I can bleed it a little before it lands on my shore, and you will carry my word to Pike even if your father uses it as kindling." Theon nodded and felt something crack inside him like a rotten timber giving way, and oddly the whole of him felt sounder because of it. Ned put a hand on his shoulder then, just once, and Theon's breath came hard. "I do not forgive you," Ned said, "but I do read you." He turned to Ser Roderick. "Give him men who know the smell of peat. Send Reedcraft with him. Aaron Damphair loves a ceremony. Let us buy time with song." Theon met Arya's eyes and flinched away, then forced himself back. "I will bring you Sansa," he said, because his mouth wanted him to die of promises, and he had never once before let it kill him. Arya's face did something complicated and then set level. "If you do that, I will not cut your throat in your sleep," she said, which was a mercy and also a sentence. At Storm's End, the sea threw its back against cliffs that had defied storms full of dragons' names. Torches sputtered along the curtain walls like a string of bees. Stannis Baratheon's camp sprawled inland, sober as a sermon. No rose laughter anywhere. Men sharpened pikes and thought about it while they did. Melisandre of Asshai walked the lines in a red gown that ate firelight and made it again on her skin. She stopped and smiled at Catelyn when Catelyn came at last, a tiredness behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the road. "You carry a stone in your pocket," Melisandre said. "Your vow." Catelyn looked down at her empty hands. "I carry many stones. I have used them to mark graves along my road." Stannis looked at both women with the impatience of a man who had always done his duty and could not understand anyone who did not make it the same shape as his. "If the wolf comes to my standard," he said, "I will give him a place he can like. He will be warden of his winter wastes and raise banners in my name and call it his name when he is alone. If he takes a crown, I will take his head, and that will be duty." Melisandre's eyes were deep wells that reflected the flicker of the torches and made them look like falling stars. "The night is dark," she murmured, "and full of terrors. And men," Catelyn said, tired as salt tastes. "Do not forget men." Brienne stood near Catelyn like a wall. Her face softened when the lane bent and Renly's entourage came. He shone, the way a man can shine when his blood is up and he has not yet spent too much of it. He kissed Marjorie's hand, and the men shouted because they liked a story told well and loudly. Catelyn put her hands between two fires and tried to hold both. "If you ride tomorrow," she said to Renly behind a pavilion's silk with only Brienne's shadow like a sundial mark to witness, "Stannis will not greet you with bread." "He will greet me with a scowl," Renly said and grinned. "Then he will greet my 3 times as many men with a scowl. The scowl will have to learn to share." Brienne's mouth twitched, perhaps at the notion of a scowl learning anything. Catelyn opened her mouth for the piece of her that had always been flint not to love him through, and then something moved. A light guttered. The candle flame elongated like a whisper drawn long. The silk trembled. A chill kissed the back of Catelyn's neck and then ran like a finger along the length of her spine. She had thought the night very dark before, but now it put on a different cloak, the darkness that has a hand. There was no explanation that was not a story, and stories never brought the living back into a room where they had gone out of it. Brienne's hand went to her sword and slipped on the hilt because her palm had found itself wet. Renly turned his head not because he heard anything, but because the hairs at the back of his neck stood up all together. He had time to say a single word. Oh, half laughter, half a boy greeting a wind that had caught his hood. And then the black blade came through the silk and through him. Brienne caught him in her arms with a sound a child makes in a dream when something falls and breaks. And then she was slick with something darker than the night, and her eyes were better than any man's eyes ever made by love because she did not look away from what had happened. Catelyn grabbed the candle and flung it at the silk, and it made no difference to the shape of what had arrived. She ran and she pulled Brienne, and the weight between them was love and crown and a thing that was already leaving. When the men burst in with steel and horns and the high sound of those whose story had been stolen from them, Catelyn was already dragging Brienne under the flap along a back rope she had cut with Ned's dagger. Brienne's breath came like a horse's, terrible and wet. They ran into white flowers bruised black by darkness, and all the while Catelyn thought, not for the first time since she had left the woman she was in Winterfell's warm stone. The gods are not gentle, and men make worse gods when they try to borrow their names. News moved through camps like fire will through flax if the flax is dry enough. The Tyrell banners went pale. The Storm Lords shouted and did not know whom to shout at. Loras rode out of Renly's pavilion with his face a cut piece of marble and his white cloak crimson at the edge. No song held him. He was all purpose and no shape. He looked for something to kill and did not find it. He looked for someone to blame and found all of them. By dawn, Stannis's watchfires burned so steady they hurt the eyes. Catelyn and Brienne had taken the third horse from the left in a line by a hedge, the one that kicked and bit because it had sense, and they were gone to Riverrun beyond any man's quick accounting. Behind them, the Reach was choosing a new spring for its crown, and it lay in a bed of gold. At Riverrun, the cellars were cold enough to keep meat. Jaime Lannister's laugh had stopped ringing against stone 3 days ago, and had not returned in quite the same shape. He seemed leaner, or perhaps the light had changed. Arya brought him water because someone must, and she had a face the cells would ignore. He took the cup and drank without looking, and then looked because people are thirsty for faces too. "Little one," he said, and for a heartbeat a piece of the man he had been before anything mattered to him but one woman and a white cloak pressed out through the gold of him. "Have you a story?" "Not for you," Arya said, and he smiled properly for the first time since he had been thrown into the stone. "Then please do not bring me the songs," he said. "The songs are never about what the day smells like. This day smells like onions and tears," Arya said. "The last one smelled like hot iron and fear. All days smell like fear down here," Jaime said, and set the cup back. She watched him for a heartbeat longer than she should, and then she turned and went because he had taken too much of any child's looks already. Outside, Hoster Tully died with the slow dignity of a man who had never asked for anything he could not pronounce. Edmure wept without shame. Catelyn arrived in time to hold her father's hand as the old lord tried 3 times to say the word for forgive, and then said fish instead, and they let that be enough. Brienne stood at the edge of the room with blood she had not washed all the way out of seams and stitches, and men were careful around her because the grief in her made a space the shape of a sword. When the pyre was built in the river and the torches took and the body went in flame into water, Catelyn put a piece of her childhood in that burning and watched the smoke fold it. She did not bend. She wrote to Ned, and the letter only said, "We are different now," which he would know how to read. Robb heard it all on a frost morning when breath made dragons, and he had counted the names of 5 men he had put on dirt heaps in the last week. He sat with his mother's letter in his lap and did not move for the span of 3 candles. Then he stood and called his captains and did the day's work, which was to bleed Tywin a little here and to leave one ditch unfilled there, and to keep the men warm enough with rage and fire that illness stayed its hand. Great John roared and broke a table, because it is possible to grieve like that too. And Meege Mormont spoke 5 words, and a man who had been weeping stopped because her voice was a hand under his chin. Roose Bolton smiled when there was no reason in the room to smile, and that was how one knew where he was when the light was poor. In King's Landing, Tyrion fed his sister fear and bread in equal measures. He found where the wildfire stood in jars and did not put his hand too close to any green glow. He watched Lancel forget his own name when Cersei brushed his wrist by accident, and he watched the hound's jaw clench when a torch guttered near his boot. He found Sansa in a solar that had a window onto nothing in particular, and they talked about nothing in particular because the walls had ears and names and he had not finished paying for the ones he needed. He gave her a fruit from Dorne because it was something that did not grow here. She thanked him like a queen, which is all that is required of a girl sometimes, and then her lip trembled for a breath she swallowed. He thought of Shay and put that thought away with the rest of them in a drawer that had no lock big enough. He wrote a note to someone who owed him, and he posted guards in a hallway, and all the while he thought, "I am building a wall around a spring that is in sand." The snow did not stay. It came and then it turned to a cold rain that polished stone and made men's fingers into fish. Ned stood on the plank road with reedmen and listened to the sound of the bog breaking into smaller bogs. Theon's ships moved out on waters that were not sea but wanted to be, sliding between islands of peat with the grace of otters. They were not built to do this, and so already what they were had been changed. Theon himself had been changed and would continue to be, which is a costly thing in any coin. He raised a flag that said truce in no language but the Nex. From one island, a long horn sounded. It was not a war sound. It was the sound of a man admitting that he did not want what he would get if he lied. Aaron Damphair came out of a fog wall in a coracle that looked like it had been made to bury a man in. He wore water like another man wears wool. "The drowned god takes and gives," he said, proud of his own prayer. Theon bowed, because one should bow to anything that believes as hard as the drowned god does. Ned spoke the way he always had before anything else, with less words than he might have, and with no lies at all. "If you strike my coast," he said, "I will strike you until salt comes out of your blood." "You have no ships," Aaron said, delighted. "We have reeds and patience," Howland Reed said, as if naming two different swords. The priest's gaze slid to him like a fish, then back to Ned. "And you have my brother's boy," he said, as if considering the shape of a sacrifice. Theon made his mouth a straight cut. "You have your brother's boy," he said. "I am here." Aaron tilted his head. He began an invocation and never finished it, because on the horizon a black line thickened and became a curve of sails that had not been promised. Balon had changed his mind or had never made it up, which is different but not for the men who stand before it. Theon swore in a language that sounded like rocks falling into the sea and turned to Ned because he had already chosen whose eyes he would meet when he cursed. Ned lifted his hand. Reed men melted into reed. The moat breathed. The world became a map made of sound. The first 3 longships cut toward them like cleavers. Arrows rose from hummocks of peat, arcing low. The men in the prows raised shields and the arrows clattered like rain on iron. Under them, the plank gave by foot by hand. And when the first ship's prow came into the narrow channel, it kissed a stake that had grown there overnight and opened its belly like a fish. Water roared into it. Men swore. One went under with his mouth open because he could not bear to close it with that much surprise in it. The second ship tried to swing wide and lodged in a bed of something that had looked like water but was old earth. The third ship found eyes looking at it from beneath water, and then it did not move anywhere at all because fear makes a net finer than any rope. They did not win a battle so much as they denied the sea the shape it wanted. Reed oil burned on black puddles and made a new kind of fog. Men who had not known fear of marsh learned it from stones they had stepped on that had never minded steps until today. Theon ran along a plank that had been laid when his hands were still pink and quick at Winterfell, and he interposed himself between a man swinging a bearded axe and a boy with hair like any summer. He took the axe swing on steel, and his arm burned all the way to his collarbone, and he laughed in the way a man laughs when he has just found the bottom of a new well. The boy darted past him with a spear that had a frog carved in the socket and put it through the iron bourne where he had forgotten to lace his mail. The man looked down at the wood that was in him and then up at Theon and made a face like a child who has been told he cannot go on a story. Then he fell backward and the peat took him and decided to keep him. It went on until time forgot to count. Balon himself did not come to that black water, of course. He watched his sails like a man counts his own ribs and found them fewer. Aaron pulled salt from his hair and put it in his mouth and spat it and called it sacrament. Theon stood beside Ned on a hummock that had only ever held reeds before and felt the world roll under his boots and steady again. He looked at Ned the way a man looks at a shore he had not thought to make. Ned looked back and did not smile, but he did not nod. "Go," Ned said at last, when the water had taken what it would take of the day. "Tell your father what song the Nex sings. If he has ears he can borrow, he should borrow them from his daughter." Theon went, and Arya watched him go with a mouth bit tight against any word at all. When he vanished into fog and the sound of oars became small, she went and found Mira Reed and learned how to move across water stuff without thinking of it as water. Mira showed her how to set her feet lightly as a dragonfly walking. Arya did it and then did it again without thinking and found that she was not afraid of bog or water or anything that moved under the surface anymore. That night, she dreamed of Nymeria's fur warm against her cheek for the first time since the wolf had run from a stone bridge in a child's world. She woke with tears on her face and she did not wipe them because they might have wanted to be there a while. North and east, Stannis took in his dead brother's host with the hunger of a man who had eaten discipline all his life and suddenly found pie on a table. Marjorie's smile did not change shape, but it cooled by a degree that only someone who had come from a colder country would name. Loras scoured the realm looking for a shadow to kill and finding only men, and he killed some of those because men will do. Catelyn reached Riverrun with Brienne and a story that was going to be a legend whether or not it had wanted to be. She told it to Ned's letter and the letter listened. Ned read it with the patience of stone and then with the heat of a man. He wrote back quietly what Catelyn already knew. Stannis had the better claim and the worse honey. But winter is a school that punishes boys who wear roses in their hair. Tywin sat in Harrenhal's hall and did not shiver because he did not know how. He wrote notes and sent them on ravens and men and promises. He wrote to Davin and to Janos Slynt and to Ev. Every man who had ever liked the taste of a coin with a lion stamped in it. He wrote to the Freys and told them that the wolves had slighted them and would slight them again, and that insult was a coin that only blood could change. He wrote to the Iron Bank and reminded them that Lannisters paid their debts and that it would be good to be owed when the realm turned upside down. He did all of this with hands that washed twice between each letter, which is not a thing the ballads ever deemed worthy of note. But men die of less care. Vargo Hoat lisped in the corner for contracts that made men into meat if they failed to be men. Tywin used him as a man uses a hooked knife. The gods looked on and kept their faces blank. On the Trident's banks a boy made a flute from a tallow reed and played 3 notes that had been his mother's song. And then he put it down because his mother had no song now and he could not be the instrument for it by himself. The sun came up red as a wound and went down gold as a promise and then red again because the world had not decided yet. In White Harbor, Lord Wyman wrote to Ned that he had had a dream of a merman spitting out knights, and he had woken up laughing and coughing together. He promised ships to break the Kraken's teeth if he had to lash them together with his own garters. Ned wrote back thank you and also remember the price of boasting in winter, which was frost on a tongue. A raven from the wall brought only a line about cold and wings. It was enough to make Ned go to the parapet and lean his brow against stone. He knew what cold meant when men in black said it. It meant that winter was not something far men said in taverns to make their cups feel warmer in their hands. It meant that the gods' game had more boards than this one. He could not fight that in any way that looked like a march or a levy or a letter. He could only hold the neck and keep the pack from eating itself while the wind decided which way it would go through the pine. Robb sent a rider to Riverrun with a simple line, "I hold." The rider died on the road because a man wanted his boots. Another rider made it, and the paper he carried had been in his mouth when he crossed the river because that was safer than a pocket. Catelyn took it from him and pressed it to her chest before she read it. Then she passed it to Brienne, and the big woman folded it like it was a small bird she meant to keep warm. Arya saw them and thought that love had 100 shapes, and some of them you could not sit next to without getting larger or smaller. Theon returned to Pike without the shape of a victory, and with the shape of a man that had been heated and hammered and quenched and not broken. Balon stared at him as if at a map that no longer had a coast where he had left it. "You brought me reeds," he said, contempt dripping like bad rain. "I brought you the truth," Theon said, and it cost him something to say it as simple as his mouth made it sound. "You cannot take the neck, not without 7 summers and a god's hand. The sea does not go there. But you can take Deepwood, and you can take Torrance Square, and you can take the Cape of Eagles. You can make the wolf look left while the lion bites his right, if you must play at being a lion's friend." Asha laughed because she had not yet learned not to laugh at a truth that is also a jest. Balon's face put on more stone. "You will take Deepwood," he said. Theon shook his head. "I will not. I will take a message to Winterfell that you are coming. And then I will stand on a wall and be a traitor to one man only." Aaron hissed. Asha looked at Theon with something like respect and something like pity and something like a hand he would not hold and did not deserve. "Go then," Balon said, and his voice was the voice of a tide that would sweep anything, even his children, from a shore when it had a mind. "Go and drown in sweet water." Theon went. Winterfell's stones knew him. They had the same temperature as all the years he had been a boy. He rode through the gates at a gallop, he had not warned the guard of because he wanted to see if the archers would loose, and he wanted to be glad if they did. They did not. They lowered spears and sank, and then Robb was there in a mail shirt with a damp cloak, because weather does not wait for king or dog. Theon slid from his saddle before it had stopped properly and went down on one knee and put his head back, because a sword is always a possibility in the north. He said, "Your Grace," because he meant it, and Robb pulled him up with hands that had put meat on a field and did not shake. "You are late," Robb said, and did not smile because the time for that was already spent. Theon told him everything. When he got to the part where he had not gone to Deepwood, he set his jaw in case the oath was coming. Robb only nodded. "You will take men and go to Deepwood now," he said. "With Glover's cousins. You will block and bleed and not boast. When your father comes, you will hold until I come too. You will not be alone." Theon swallowed, something like prayer and something like penance cutting the inside of his throat. "I am not a good man," he said. "Be a useful one," Robb said. "It is winter." Ned stood on Moat Caelan's highest stone and watched the sky change its colors without warming. He thought of Lyanna and of the thing he had held back from the world until his beard had many white hairs and his leg was not what it had been. He thought of Jon, and of the letters he had sent, and of the way Stannis's ravens had gone over the water like a storm the sea had not ordered. He thought of Cersei and Sansa and the little king with the needle points on his shoes. He thought of Arya balancing on a plank with Mira Reed's face turned up with pride, and he thought of Robb with gray in his gaze. He thought of Theon's shoulders when the boy man had turned his back on a man who had never learned to hold anything he had not taken. He thought of Roose Bolton's smile, because a man should always keep a ledger of the smiles men wear. He thought of the wall. He thought of the smell of snow before it falls. He went down the stairs because a man must go down the stairs after he has done thinking of all that. He picked up a quill and made another list. He put men where they fit. He moved grain where it would not rot. He wrote to White Harbor and asked Lord Wyman for fish in barrels with the tops well pitched. He wrote to the Mormonts and asked them to put a woman with each boy so that the boys would not be too brave. He wrote to the Umbers and told them to yell less and dig more. He wrote to the Karstarks and did not write Karstark where he wrote the word patience, but he thought it. He wrote to Riverrun and to the Eyrie and to Pike and to a little holdfast in the hills where a boy's father had died with his mouth full of oath and blood, and a child would need a sword when he could lift it. He sent the ravens and turned his head and listened to the wind, and no, it was not a song, but it was not nothing either. It was late when a cry came down from the west tower that was not a horn nor a raven, but the call of a man who had been a boy and had discovered something and remembered to set his voice into the right shape for it. Ned climbed again and told his leg to hold. At the top, the boy gave him a looking glass that had belonged to some Southron man once and now belonged to the neck, because everything does if you leave it there long enough. Ned sighted along the black water to the last brightness. In the far distance, a flame brightened and then fell and then brightened again. Not a fire, not torches, but a pulse like something breathing. It lay far inland. It was the ghost of green. He had seen wildfire once and did not need to be told its color on the sky. He lowered the glass and looked north and then south, because the choice was not in the glass or the sky but always on the ground under his feet. He put the glass back into the boy's careful hands and said, simply, "Tell Howland." The boy ran and Ned stood and watched a sky that told him a story without words. It said, "There will be another board when you have finished this one." It said, "A man does not stand anywhere but where he does." It said, "Hold." The rain came then, steady, each drop a single deliberate act. He turned his face into it and let it run, and for a heartbeat the ache in his leg left him. He breathed and it tasted of peat and iron and the faint sweetness of pine far off, and when he opened his eyes the torches had been lit along the walls and a reed flute was playing somewhere in the dark. He went down into it because that is where his people were, and because the night would be long and wolves run better together. The rain eased toward midnight, thinning to a tick of water along the stone and a slow, patient drip in the hollow of a broken merlin. Ned leaned his palms on the parapet and watched the last of the smoky light fade from the southern sky. No more pulses of green breathed there, only the flat black of a night that had put away its tricks. Behind him the moat murmured. water touching stone, reed against reed, the grumble of frogs that never learned silence even in war. He stayed until the damp worked through his cloak and into the ache of his leg, then turned and took the stair with the careful economy of a man who has measured his body's limits and means to spend them in coin, not in pride. Howland Reed was waiting at the foot of the tower in a collar of wet rushes that glistened like a necklace of small snakes. His smile showed one narrow tooth that made him look younger than he was. "Our knight had a tale to tell," he said, soft as peat smoke. Ned nodded. It told it twice for those who did not listen the first time. They walked beneath the black throat of the arch and into the yard where a willow shed rained the way a hound sheds river water. Ned paused beneath its curtain and lowered his voice. "The city plays with wildfire." Howland's head cocked. 2 drops slid off the edge of his nose. "Men who hold torches in a wind forget that wind is a god in its own right." "Tyrion knows what he does," Ned said, not wholly as censure. "And yet, that green is not a tool. It is a hunger." He took a breath that tasted of wet rope and old iron. "Ravens must go to Robb and to Seaguard and White Harbor, take ships off the Blackwater's mouth. If Stannis puts to sea to claim what is his, he'll row into a tide of fire unless someone breaks it." "We can break a tide," Howland said, amused. "We live in one." Ned did not sleep. He sat with a taper and letters until wax slicked his fingers, until the reed pen's nib went rough and the parchment hoarded scratches. He wrote Stannis plain words in a hand that would not be mistaken. "Do not give the lion a river that can burn." He wrote to Wyman Manderley asking for ships to prowl the gullet and worry any fleet that bore the fiery heart. To Jason Mallister for oars and eyes along the forks. To Robb, "Hold your patience where a green sky tells you to hurry, and send me riders with news as if news were bread." When he stopped to flex the cramp from his hand, the taper had guttered to a thumb's length. He warmed stiff fingers over the stubby flame, and in that wavering light he saw the ghost of Lioness' face in his own knuckles, fine-boned, stubborn. "Promise me," she had said. He was promising with ink now and with men. At sunrise the yard smelled of wet hay and wood smoke and stewed oats. Arya picked at the skin of a blister with her teeth and spat it with satisfaction. Mira Reed sat cross-legged in the damp, stringing a fish spear with braided gut. Jojen lay on his back on the plank walk and watched fog move like a slow beast across the low water. When Ned limped near, Mira bounced up with a grin, flicking rain from her braid. "Arya walked the dragonfly path last night," she said proudly. "She didn't sink even when the reed pad gave." Arya scowled. "I would have sunk if I wanted to," she said. "I didn't." Ned cupped the back of her skull and felt the damp heat of her through hacked hair. "Remember what you did with your feet," he said. "There'll be a time you'll need to do it with your heart." Arya made a face at riddles and went to stab the air with needle until Mira laughed and corrected her wrists. Jojen propped himself up on his elbows. "I dreamed," he said, conversational as if he had told them he liked the porridge. Howland's head turned. Ned waited. The boy's eyes were green as moss taken from a well. "The river in the city had a door," Jojen went on. "It shut all at once and the ships cracked against it like beetles in a child's fist. But some beetles flew. The green fire ran out under the door and made a wind." He squinted up into the brightening cloud as though there were writing up there to read. "I dreamed a wolf howled and a kraken did not laugh." He dropped back to the planks, satisfied. Howland's mouth pressed into a brief line and then smoothed. "Dreams are weather," he said to Ned. "But sometimes the weather tells you what it wants a day in advance." Ned nodded, though a coldness slid between his ribs and stayed. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister tied a kerchief over his nose and breathed anyway. The Alchemist's Guildhall was at once dank and scalding, the air a fume of brimstone and rot that clung in layers the way fever clings to sheets. Haleen the pyromancer beamed as if leading him through a gallery of tapestries instead of a warren of stone where one too loose elbow might name a martyr. "We have 2,000 jars fit, my lord," Haleen said, voice smug as a cat with cream. "And another 500 that will take the spark by sundown if the gods are willing." "The gods have been willing to burn men since men named them gods," Tyrion said lightly. Let us not name ourselves gods and see what becomes of our eyebrows. Helene led him to a kiln where clay cracked as if it hated the heat that made it strong. Beyond, a narrow chamber opened onto a yard that had once been a garden and now was a square of scorched dirt stippled with black glass beads where sand had melted. A wooden cask sat in the exact center of the yard, planked fresh and bound with iron that had sweated green along the seams. Helene gestured, smiling. A demonstration. Only a spoonful, mind. Aegon's shade watches. He nodded, and an apprentice with lash scars puckered pale under his ears stepped forward carrying a ladle. He dipped. The liquid in the ladle was the color of thick spring leaves just before they darken. It moved slowly, as if resentful, clinging to iron as syrup clings. Tyrion felt the hair on his arms rise. Sand? The boy murmured to himself, and threw a pinch in the air. It fell around him in a dry ring. He held the ladle over the cask and tipped. The drop kissed wood. For a heartbeat nothing happened, then the yard inhaled. A flower of green opened without flame, and yet the heat that leapt into Tyrion's face made his eyes water and his teeth sing. The cask did not catch fire. It ceased to be cask and became a sudden argument with heat, a collapse into light. Helene sighed the way some men sigh at their children's weddings. When it was done, the yard held a char where the cask had been, edges white as bone. Bronn, who had not flinched when men swung swords near his head, had taken 3 steps and not remembered them. He spat now and scowled at the spittle's instant hiss. "Pretty," he said. Tyrion wiped his streaming eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Deadly, filthy, and dear, my favorite things." He stood until the cooling yard stopped trembling underfoot. "We'll fill the river's mouth with iron and pray it all goes the way my sister's plans usually do not." "You might pray for wind," Helene said wistfully, "to herd them just so." "I do not pray," Tyrion said, and thought of a boy he had saved and could not save and a woman he paid to love him and did, a little. "I plan." He planned chains. Tobo Mott's apprentices gaped, then grinned Farrell and began to measure. The smiths on the Street of Steel cursed the dwarf by dawn and blessed him by noon when he flung them coin enough to keep their wives in tarts for a winter. Down in the mud gate a riverman watched iron links as big as his head float like millstones and guessed he would have a story to tell if he lived. In the Red Keep Cersei studied the map of the city with a glass in her hand and slurred only when she meant to. "Put the girls in the Maegor's holdfast," she told Ser Boros, and then did not, because her mind slid like an eel when handed a corner. "Keep Sansa where I can see her." She sent for Lancel, and when he came she turned the ring on her finger in circles and watched his eyes follow it like a dog's. "Our father will handle the north," she said, and believed it because she had to believe something. Sansa walked to the sept because walking made her feel she existed somewhere beyond the Queen's eyes. Inside, candles made a forest that was not Winterfell's. The mother stared up gentle and empty from her niche. The maiden's lips had cracked. The stranger had no face at all behind its veil, and Sansa loved it for that. She put her hand on the cold stone of the crone's lantern and thought of her own hands years ago covered in flour as she tried to help the cook make oatcakes. She had not then known that a hand can learn any work if it is hungry enough. She whispered a prayer she did not recognize until she had spoken it. Let him be the man they say he is when they tell stories about him. She did not have to say her father's name to make the prayer go where she wanted it to. Storm's End watched the sea beat itself into lace and into ropes and into fists. Davos Seaworth fingered the luck bone he wore on a thong and tried not to think of smoke with hands. Stannis listened to his captains give him the numbers they had counted twice, and he counted them a 3rd time aloud as if arithmetic would shame the ocean into obedience. "We sail at full tide," he said. "We aim for the mouth. The city cannot eat all our ships." Melisandre said nothing. When she looked at the sea, it looked back as if they had an arrangement. Davos thought of onions rotting in holds long ago as he ran a gauntlet the world had said could not be run. He thought of a little boy he had named after a king who was not a king then, and how that boy had died of a sickness men would call by the name of the wind. He prayed to a god he did not believe in because men pray to anything when there is a storm and a narrow mouth to put a ship through. Harrenhal's shadow made its own weather. Rob paced along the edge of it with mud on his boots and a strip of raw meat for Grey Wind, who took it and looked beyond him always, toward the thing that had not yet shown its teeth. Taciturn riders came and went bearing news like knives. Tywin moving, Tywin still, Tywin baiting. Raiders along the Red Fork. A fry train delayed because the old lord had a cough and then because he did not. Food spoiling in wagons because someone had packed it in straw that had been damp. He sent men with axes to cut new poles. Men with stomachs to eat the meat now before it turned sweet in the wrong way. Men with tongues to say words to small lords who had begun to look homeward. He slept 2 hours, then none. He let Meage Mormont cuff a boy too brave for his own breakfast, and he thanked her with a nod as sober as a pledge. Roose Bolton watched everything with pale interest. He saw the way the Fry messengers made too many apologies before they came to the point that needed none. He saw the way Karstark took longer to sharpen his sword these days, as if drawing out the steel's song kept his sons just behind him in the dark. He saw how Robb went to the healers' tents after a skirmish and spoke softly to the men who would lose their legs at dawn, and he filed at WH. Ere he filed the weight of a cloak and the price of leather in a wet year. He smiled very slightly when the rain stopped and very slightly when it began again. Jaime Lannister lay in his cell and counted stones by finger and by tongue until his mind went quiet enough to sleep. He dreamed of a boy climbing, and of pushing him, and of the way Mercy felt when you had already fallen past the place Mercy lives. When he woke there was water by his hand and a heel of bread that tasted of flour too new and a flicker of a torch in the corridor like the light you see on the inside of your eyelids when you press them. He laughed without wanting to, and it echoed back as if another man in another cell had laughed first and was telling him to stop. Catelyn stood on Riverrun's wall while the last smoke of Hoster Tully's pyre braided into the night. Brienne stood with her, great and quiet, as if someone had taken a mountain and taught it how to listen. "I failed him," Brienne said, in a voice that would have broken if iron could break. "You loved him," Catelyn said. "That is what men mean when they say they failed." "I will not fail again," Brienne said. "You will," Catelyn said very gently, "and you will live all the same." In the yard below, Edmure lifted a cup and put it down again and lifted it once more. He would always have that gesture, Catelyn thought, his mind trying to make two manners and end with one. She went to him later and put her hand over his cup, and he nodded and set it aside. "Sisters write us from towers and men write us from swamps," she said. "We must read them and be one letter between." He wept with his head in her lap, and it did not shame him, and she cried too, and it did not shame her. South along the stone shore, Theon Greyjoy learned how the Glover cousins swore when a pine bough snapped under wet snow. Deepwood Mott smelled of sap and meat and women's competence. Daisy Mormont had come with 30 bears in boiled leather, and she put her shoulder against Gates like she would put it against a man who had forgotten how to bow. "You had to come back," she said by way of greeting, and clapped Theon on the back so hard his teeth cracked together. He swallowed the noise that wanted out. "There's iron out there sniffing," she said, jerking her chin toward the pines. "They think we will run out and meet them where their boots bite." "We will not," Theon said, and almost smiled because he was allowed to decide that. "We will let them bring wet wood to their own fire." Asha came in moonlight with her boots muffled in leather and her knives oiled. The first two men found the wire snares Theon's Eelhard boys had laid and did not find their way out of them. The third man found an arrowhead an inch behind his ear and learned that you can mistake wind for friend. Theon listened to the Ironborn break brush like they had never been told forests have ears, and he leaned close to Daisy and told her where to set her pikes and where to leave a gap that was not a gap but a mouth. He smelled the salt in his sister's hair before he saw her. "Come down," Asha called softly into the trees, not to him but to the night. "Bring your truth." Theon stood and did not speak. She came to the foot of the motte with her hands spread, and he could have killed her there with 3 men and a bit of rope. He shook his head and she smiled. "You are still you," she said, not unkind. "I am," he said, "and not." They circled one another with words until dawn made the trees into charcoal. Then she melted away into the pines and left 2 men dead and 1 boy captured who spat on Theon until he ran out of spit and could only weep. "Your father will come with more," Daisy said, scrubbing blood from her gauntlet with sand. My father would come with the sea if he could pick it up, Theon said, and looked east because his heart would always, it seemed. He cannot lift the bog. Ravens came as if the sky owed them, bearing words sharp and dull. From the wall, Maester Eamon's hand, thin as a spider's leg, wrote that the cold had teeth now and did not only bite in stories. The old bear rides, the letter said, and Ned felt the pull in his bones as if the north itself had tugged his tendon. From White Harbor, Wyman Manderley swore by fish and flour to stuff barrels the size of small houses and float them south on any tide that would have them. From Seaguard, Jason Mallister sent a small, neat map with ink pricks where his outriders had seen sails with borrowers' flags. Tyrell Green, Florent Fox, Renly's summer fleets renamed to Stannis's autumn. From the twins, a thin apology and 2 fat demands written out of all proportion to content. Ned burned that last one and sent another offer that met neither insult nor cupidity, then took Arya to the yard and set her to the target until she panted. Words are spears, he said. You throw often and hard, and sometimes one goes where you mean. On a day so clear it made the world a knife. A rider pounded into Harrenhal's shadow with his horse's flanks froth-white and his saddle smoking under him. He slid down and fell to a knee and could not speak for a handful of heartbeats. When he did, the name he gave the danger wore no disguise. Tywin marches. Robb's counsel came up around him with the sound of men poorly masking impatience as if it were competence. Toward the Blackwater, the rider gasped. Not to it, a side road. To the Rose Road, to the city, to the ships. He coughed until a brown thread seeped from one nostril. He means to dance with dragons of a new sort. Robb's mouth went thin. He will have to step quick then. He turned to Bolton without thinking, and that was a measure of how tired he was. Flay their foragers, he said. Leave him food that looks like food until it is not. Roosa's lips formed a crescent. With pleasure, your grace. Send to my father, Robb said to Galbart Glover. Tell him to prick every man's ears between White Harbor and Seaguard for news of sail and flame. If the river burns, I would have the north know it before its light reaches our clouds. In King's Landing, Sansa stood in a window slit and watched a chain that looked like a dark river crawl across the mouth of the real one. She did not understand iron and water, but she did understand mouths, and the way this one closed gave her a coldness she could not swallow. Joffrey dragged her to the battlements to hear him boast, and when she did not flinch at his worst jests, he grew bored and called for his crossbow and made the men in the yard stand straighter with it the way dogs stand when a whip cracks. The hound watched her quietly, as he always did when the boy king was cruel for sport. Your sister would spit, he growled out of the side of his mouth, not looking at her at all. And you would eat fire, Sansa said without thinking, and he turned his head as if she had reached out and touched him. I've eaten worse, he said, and for a heartbeat his mouth softened. She could see the scar more plainly in that human shape, and she was ashamed because part of her had put it away as a monster's mask to make her fear easier. Tyrion walked the line of the walls with a notebook under his arm and a hangover he had earned, pointing and barking and flattering because men responded to all three, and there was no time to guess which the moment required. Buckets? He snapped at a sergeant. And sand, for when your courage minds its own business while your hands forget. I have courage, the sergeant snarled. Then lend some to your friends, Tyrion said, and grinned and moved on. He stopped at the mud gate to run his palm along the iron bar they would drop when the chain was hauled taut. It throbbed like a heart under his touch. If this fails, he told Bronn, we will swim. I don't swim, Bronn said. I float, Tyrion said, on money and malice. The day the sea brought Stannis to the city's throat, the sky had a white glare that made the river look like metal shavings. From the moat, 2 ravens wheeled into the south with letters that would reach no one in time to change a ship's course by an inch. Ned watched them go, then stood with Howland above the black water and felt it breathe under him like a beast asleep. We will hold while they burn and after, he said. Howland nodded. Men will come north who are afraid, he said. They will not like the smell of peat. We will give them bread and bed and teach their feet how to walk on water. Ned let out a breath he had not known he was holding. You will, he said. I will send them strength enough that when they learn, they can go south again and not sink. He did not see the first flash of green on the horizon, though men later swore the sky cracked like a cut apple. He heard the word carried upriver by rumor faster than smoke climbs, a syllable the color of an old forest, wildfire. The moat took the news the way it took rain, with patience. Deepwood Mott took it differently. Daisy Mormont slapped the splinters off a table and swore by 3 bears and a fish, spooking a child who had come to ask for more bread. Theon leaned on his palms and stared at nothing because he could see too much. If the river burns, he said, the lion and the stag will eat the stag's smaller brother and claim that he asked for it. What do we do? Daisy demanded. We make the kraken break his teeth on our wall, Theon said, anger sharpening him like a good whetstone. And we write to Robb and tell him the coast is a mouth with 2 tongues now, and one of them is fire. At Harrenhal, Robb's messengers flew with orders written as spare as winter soup. He sent men to the fords and to the mills and to the hills where hawks nested. He sent the Great John to the Green Fork with a grin you could have used for a lantern on a black night. He sent Bolton to sit where sitting would hurt him least. He sent Grey Wind the length of the line, and the beast returned with a pelt clotted with burrs and a look in his eyes that said he had seen things men were worse for seeing. In Riverrun, Catelyn stood up straighter than she had since she was 10 and put her hands on the table and said to Edmure, "No one crosses unless I say so." And he drew himself up and said, "No one crosses unless I say so." And she did not correct him because there are victories small and large, and sometimes they are one victory wearing 2 cloaks. In King's Landing, Sansa watched the sky turn to emerald and then to night at noon, and she did not scream. In the yard behind the sept, the hound tore off his helm and threw it, and it rolled end over end like a coin in a game that had just ended in blood. Tyrion stood on the parapet with soot on his face and grease on his hands and shouted to men who had forgotten their names, and they heard him and remembered. He thought, in some small private corner of his skull that survived fire, that maybe, just maybe, his father would not be disappointed in this one thing. When the tide turned and surged back and the chain sank or did not, depending on which song a man preferred. When the smoke took what lungs it could and left the lungs it could not have with scars that would sing in winter. When Stannis's men found ladders that did not find stone, and when other ladders did. When all that had happened, men were left alive and others were not, and the city still stood, and the river had learned a new color. No raven carried that to the moat because the ravens were tired, but the wind bore a taste of ash that men smelling bog their whole lives could not name. "It will take them a long time to clean that," Arya said, innocent with the cruelty of children who tell the truth. Ned put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed once. "Yes," he said, "there were other tidings. There are always other tidings." Men in the Fry camp drank and laughed too loudly, as if to drown out the way their old lord's cough sounded through the canvas at night. 2 Karstark men went down to the cellars in Riverrun with knives that had mother's prayers carved on the hilts and came back with hands red to the wrists. It was not Jaime they had gone to, but boys with Lannister hair, squires whose deaths would not taste any different to their fathers if those fathers learned it was not Jaime. Edmure's face went white as linen when he saw the bodies. Catelyn's mouth became a cut and the blood left it. She went to Robb's banner with the news, and his eyes fell closed only long enough to teach himself to open them again. He sat on a stool and waited for the men to be brought before him, and when they were he spoke without fury because his voice did not need it. "I will not have the North made a memory men spit after," he said. He ordered the 2 hanged at dawn, and he ordered Karstark held from his tent, and he ordered no man to speak to him until Robb himself had found the words that would cut or not cut. He took a long time. When at last he went alone save Grey Wind, and when he came out his face had the stiffness of leather that has been dried by smoke. "Bring him to the Godswood," he said. "The old gods will hear why." Ned's raven with word of wildfire reached Robb late, but reached him. Robb read and looked to the south where the sky had already told him the same thing. He wrote back, "I hold." He added, "Father, watch the phrase. They grin like men who mean to sell you their mothers and bargain about the price of milk." He smiled grimly at his own poor jest. He wanted, suddenly and with all the ferocity of a boy, to be in Winterfell's kitchen tearing hot bread and buttering it until it wept. He stood up and was a king again. Night at the moat turned all sounds into the same slow note. Ned sat with Howland and with a handful of graybeards from the closest villages. Men who remembered the last winter well enough to mourn their teeth. They spoke of salt and of peat and of the way wolves came down off the pines when the meat ran out. They spoke of boys who had gone south and would not come back even if they lived because something in them had learned a language you could not translate for a hearth. The talk wound around and back as talk in the north does until it made a loop you could put over the day and pull it into evening. Later, when Arya had fallen asleep with Needle's hilt under her palm and Mira had coiled into her blanket like a bright eel and Jojen had said he would dream later and then had fallen asleep anyway, Ned went to the Godswood. The moat's heart trees were long cut in the south, their faces burned or dragged down to make bridges. There were pale stumps that oozed a kind of white that was not life. But in a corner, a thin sapling had climbed out of the earth and put up 3 leaves a shade of crimson only the north makes. Ned knelt before it. The ground wet his knees. He did not make a prayer. He made a list. He spoke names to the little tree: Lyanna, Benjen, Jon, Sansa, Arya, Robb, Bran, Rickon. He spoke Catelyn's name last and longest. Then he said, "I will not break." And the wind did not answer, and he counted that as agreement. A dawn came pale as linen washed too many times. The reek of char drifted from the south like an old dream. Ned called for Ser Roderick and for the Reed Lords and for the Carls from Bear Island who had come to the moat to learn how to stand on water. He laid out boards and pegs and stones. He set men where the land would eat horses. He sent riders to White Harbor and told them to take the river roads with caution because rumor runs there like rats. He sent another raven to Winterfell with a short scrap: "Keep the hearths lit." He put down his cup and looked out where the world ended in fog and thought, "Men will come here hungry. We will feed them and then teach them to be hungry in ways that make them live." In King's Landing, the bells tolling victory sounded more like grief when heard through smoke. Tyrion lay in a bed with blood on the pillow that had been his face's and woke with words that came out crooked for an hour and then straightened. And he congratulated himself on having kept his tongue in his mouth. Cersei kissed her son in public and drank where no one saw and had a headache the size of a stag's head and qualities no song would name. The Hound left. He took his fear and his rage and his singed hair and he left. Sansa stood in the sept again and put her hand on the crone's lantern and felt the stone's cold go into her bones, and she liked it because it was clean. Tywin rode east with roses at his back and a new marriage coiled around the throat of the city like a pretty scarf. The Freys wrote Robb a letter in which the word insult appeared 7 times and the words regret and amends appeared not at all. Roose Bolton watched the writing pass from hand to hand and smiled the way a man smiles when he has laid his knife down just where his hand will want it later. Catelyn held her father's ring and looked at it long enough to see not the metal but the finger it had sat upon since she was a girl. And then she put it in a box with a lock and told no one where she put the key. Theon stood on Deepwood's palisade and watched fog move. It looked like a field of men advancing if you stared too long. He gripped the rail with hands that had learned to hold without shaking and listened to Daisy Mormont berate a boy for dulling a spear on a stone. "The stone wins," she snapped. "Always." He could see in his mind his sister's smile and his father's scorn and Ned's steady eyes. And he did not choose among them because sometimes the only choice is to look at all the truths you have been given and not blink. In the neck, Arya walked the dragonfly path until her feet knew it as well as her mouth knew her name. Mira taught her to throw a net that was not net and to catch fish that were not fish and to find plover eggs without breaking them. Jojen dreamed and woke and dreamed again, and once he touched Arya's wrist lightly when she passed him and said, "You'll see your sister," as if he were mentioning rain. Arya stopped and swallowed a breath and tried to decide if she believed that words could make a bridge that long. She went to the practice yard and put needle through a circle of bark until her shoulder burned in a way that was almost happiness. Ned took up his staff and went to the wall again when the next raven came, because the boy at the West Tower had been trained to cry out when the birds showed and Ned wanted to make sure he always would. He cracked the seal with his thumb, smudging wax. The letter inside bore a hand he had not seen on parchment in years and knew as you know the step of a man in a corridor outside your door. Stannis' strokes were iron and unadorned. The city holds and the boy sits on his chair. "I will not be dissuaded," Send me your swords and your witness." Ned exhaled, long. He looked to Howland, who had come up behind him soft-footed as dusk. "If I send men to a king, he should be the king," Ned said. "If he is the king, he should be in a place where he can hold a winter." Howland's mouth quirked. "The place with the oldest winter is north," he said. Ned smiled despite himself. "So I must make the wall between a king and his hunger of a kind that will not break when he leans." He lowered his eyes to the letter and saw between the lines a man who had eaten bitterness until his teeth shone with it. He sent ravens again, and one sent to Robb began simply, "Hold." Another to Catelyn said, "Over good men's graves we will build." One to White Harbor said, "Save your fat for the lean days." He wrote to the Umbers and asked them to keep the roads open with more spade than song. He wrote to the Karstarks and asked them to hold grief by the throat one day longer. He wrote to the Freys with words that tasted like chalk and bile and necessity and honor in a winter that was coming, and would not ask how much pride a man had brought with him. The moat breathed. The reeds shivered in a wind that had traveled over things on fire and things drowned and things that had been kissed by snow. Ned stood and listened. A new sound wove into the old, oars far off, and the creak of leather and the low murmur of men who think their voices can hide in fog. Theon's horns answered from Deepwood a world away. Robb's banners shuddered in an inland gale that might have been a messenger's horse throwing up clods of red mud. Catelyn's hand closed on a new letter as she opened an old box. Arya's foot came down on the plank and did not sink. Tyrion set a goblet down without spilling and smiled with half his mouth because the other half wanted to snarl. Stannis counted and did not stop. Night poured into the neck like oil, slick and cold and transforming everything it touched into a version of itself that reflected fire. Ned lifted his face to it. Wolves howled far beyond the marsh. The sound came strange across the water and the reeds, as if it had been braided with voices. The old gods did not speak. That was never their way. They listened, and the pack ran on. The fog lifted in ribbons over the peat, and a dull sun pressed its weight through thinning cloud. Ned watched the day unwrap itself with the wonderless patience of a man who had learned that dawn, and only dawn, could be relied on. A reed man trotted up the plank road with water beating on his cap and a wet leather tube under his arm. The raven he carried wore a red thread at its leg, the color Ned had instructed the Riverrun rookery to use for matters that could not wait on bread or bandages. He took the message, felt the grit in the sand shaken over fresh ink, and knew before his thumb broke the seal it was bad. It was not the worst thing a man might be told. The worst things arrived without words at all. But the lines lanced like sleet all the same. 2 young Lannisters dead by Karstark knives. Their lord held in chains and spitting. Robb Stark calling for judgment beneath leafless boughs. He set the parchment on the sill and let the wind flatten it, read again the spare strokes made by Catelyn's hand recounting what she had witnessed. She did not gild details, only marked the hour, the names, the sight of boys who wore the wrong sigil cooling on stone. He could feel her trying, even across wet miles, not to think of Sansa pressed into a lady's posture in a snake's den, not to see Bran's small legs in the wrong door. Howland came to him without needing to be called, reeds dripping from his belt. He read over Ned's shoulder, a liberty few men alive would take. "Your son carries steel where words once lay," he said finally. "He must," Ned answered, and looked past him into the marsh, as if the water itself might untangle a knot tied by hot blood. "But I will not let the North turn execution into an appetite. Karstark's grief swallows counsel. Robb must weigh mercy or make the cost of justice so plain no lordman can name it vengeance. Plainness is its own blade," Howland said. "It cuts more than meat. Then we will bleed for it once," Ned said, and he felt the decision settle in his bones the way a man feels winter's first true freeze. He turned from the window and called for Ser Roderick. "We go to Riverrun," he said simply. "You will hold the moat with Lord Reed. Send riders to White Harbor and Seaguard. Make plain to every captain on the Bight that Ironborn sails are to be harried into the Kraken's teeth and not brought north of the cliffs. And if word comes that Tywin moves with haste, Send a hawk to me and a raven to Robb without counting the expense. Roderick's whiskers twitched, which meant he disapproved and would obey. Your leg. My leg will come with me or I'll drag it by a leash, Ned said dryly, which made Howland snort like a frog startling itself. Arya stays. Arya stepped from behind the door jamb with a small, determined scowl that told him she had intended to hear this and was equal parts pleased and furious. I can walk a plank road in fog. You can, Ned agreed. And you'll teach Mira what you know of Needle while I teach Robb what I know of standing a king upright. He crossed the room and tugged the strap of her jerkin with 2 fingers in a way that had once made her giggle and now made her roll her eyes. For a heartbeat the years fell away and he saw her in winter blue, her hair uncut. Guard the moat, he said. Guard your brother's path home. That's a king's work too. Mira, perched on a stool mending net with deft brown fingers, nodded gravely. We will keep her, she said, with that bright reed pride that accepted no correction. Jojen only looked at Arya a moment and said to nobody, Grey water moves where men swear ground, then went back to staring at a knot he hadn't tied. They took the river roads in a half-hidden file, skirting hamlets where the smell of fish still clung to hung racks and the fear of sails clung to the women collecting wash from lines that had hung the same laundry since their own mothers. Reed skiffs slid parallel in black channels, spears idle but not unminded. Ned rode under a hood despite the wetted heat. He was recognizable by bearing more than face in these parts, but bearing could be muffled as well as a cheek. At night they made a small fire under a willow's weeping edge and slept in a circle with their feet to heat like old wolves. Near midstream they crossed a caravan of freedmen, men and women both, skin wind-cracked and eyes too wide, who had come from the southern roads with talk that did not surprise Ned but made the younger riders cross themselves. Wildfire in the river, a chain like a serpent across the mud gate's mouth, a king's fleet split like crabs under a wheel. A woman with a blade scar on her cheek added that Joffrey Baratheon had thrown a man from the wall for failing to die prettily. She had not seen it with her eyes. She had seen the fear pass from mouth to mouth until it became something to carry to the next fire. Ned took it, like the bread he handed her, without remark. They reached Riverrun under a sky as clear as hammered tin. The castle's red towers looked less like celebration and more like old wounds with a scab over them. In the great hall, Robb stood beneath Trout and Direwolf and heard his mother speak. Rickard Karstark was brought in between 2 mailed men with faces like unsharpened axes. He had gone gray where his beard once burned brown. The grief in his eyes was not new, but it was fresh, like a bruise you press to find the pain still there. He spat at the sight of the Kingslayer's pale hair on a banner pole in the corner, and when he saw Ned he barked a laugh without joy. Well, he said, wolves breed more wolves. Will you teach your son to lay a soft hand on the knives that slit your throats, Eddard Stark? Or will you remember the names of your dead children? I have not forgotten one, Ned said. The hall felt smaller around him than it had years ago, and he had been shorter then. He said nothing else, because every other word a man says in such a hall becomes a stone someone throws tomorrow. Robb led them through another door under a lintel so old hands had worn it smooth to a godswood that was mostly a small mossed corner and a single heart tree whose carved face had been abraded by river wind. He had them take the man to the foot of that face, and he put his sword point down in the earth beside him and spoke. Ned did not think the boy spoke well. He did not speak like a singer's king. There were no phrases to be remembered by Hearth for a century, but he spoke like a Stark, and the words were clean and cut where they had to. The dead boys' names were set in line, and he did not make them a rope to strangle anyone else with. The laws of war were named, and he did not pretend they bent to grief any more than river stone bends to hands. Karstark stood as if all this were mud in his ear and waited. Do you repent? Robb asked, because that was part of the shape of a ritual men pretend is not ritual. Karstark bared his teeth. I repent that I was not quicker with my blade, he said. I repent that you are half a king and less of a wolf. I repent that I bent the knee to a boy who will have his father's soft mercy and his mother's soft heart when lions come with fire. Robb's mouth whitened at the corners. The men around them murmured, hungry as crows. Ned did not move. Once he would have stepped to place a hand on a shoulder. Once he would have said a word that shifted the wind a finger's width. But this was his son's kill to make or not make. He had no right to take it. Robb took it. He did not order an executioner. He lifted the sword he had been given, a king's sword, and he did what kings do and do not live long for. Karstark died quick and with his chin up. He did not close his eyes. When he fell, the ground took the blood and the tree watched without speaking, which is all trees ever do. They burned the body toward dusk. The Karstark men broke their tents before dawn and left with the light like a herd that has decided the fence is decoration and not law. Robb stood at the gate and watched them go with his jaw set. He lost near 2,000 men in numbers and perhaps a third of that in weight, for grief adds ballast as well as subtracts obedience. He did not lower his head. He sent men after to count, which is what a king who has been hurt does instead of saying it. In the thick stone chamber that had been Hoster's and now was a room without a name, Ned found Catelyn with a cloth in her hands and nothing to wipe. She sat, booklet straight, and when he came in she loosened and leaned her head against his chest like she had not done since their bed had been Winterfell's oak. "You should have sat him down when he was small and taught him how to not be old," she said in his shirt. He put a hand to her hair. "He will be older tomorrow," he said. "That is the mercy grief has that we always forget. It goes. It leaves scars. Men still walk. He will need friends who do not smile too much," she said, voice steadier. "The phrase smile. Roose smiles. There are too many smiles." "There will be fewer," Ned said. "I will see to that." He did not say how because he did not yet know, and truth ungilded had always served him better in private than any painted certainty. Robb came to them after taking counsel from men who offered too much or too little. He stood in the door the way he had stood in the gods would, a shadow grown the shape of a lord but still thin where winter wants marrow. "I have broken Karstark," he said, as if reporting a levy. "Phrase will call it weakness and strength both. I will not break twice in a week." Ned nodded once. "Then you will not," he said. "Write to Lord Walder in the same breath you send to the twins for bread. Send Daisy Mormont with the message. Phrase like to be scolded by women less than by men. It rings of mothers, and they do not like mothers unless they own them." Catelyn snorted despite herself. Robb, startled, almost smiled. "Mother will go with her," he said, and his voice had iron under it again. "Our uncle has letters to write to Seaguard and Fairmarket, and he will write them without flourishes. If Walder turns his back on bread, he turns his back on his own grandchildren's supper." "We will send him a song too," Catelyn said. "Men who deny being moved by it do so when no one sees them." "A song," Robb repeated, bemused, and then shook his head as if to shake off a dream. "Father," he said more formally, and the word still startled Ned and pleased him with pain. "You must not sit the moat empty." "I am not empty," Ned said, amused dry. "Howland Reed is worth 5 lords when the ground is bog. Ser Roderick is 2 when it is stone. And I intend to leave again with dawn. I mean to see Lord Wyman's docks with my own eyes and walk the planks of Seaguard and set my hand to the chains on boats that will break a kraken's nose. The North will not starve while I hold a quill." Robb shook his head, and this time the smile did come. "By all accounts you hold a sword more easily than a pen," he said, which was the closest he could get to saying "Father, stay and teach me to be a boy again." Ned reached across and rapped his knuckles, a ghost of the correction he had given the child who had once knocked over a candle playing at being a stag. "By all accounts you are my son," he said. "The rest can be proved." Word flew north slower than rumor. On Pike, Aaron sloshed salt water over his own head and called the last skirmish in the neck a test set by his god for men who had forgotten drowning's lesson. He preached until his throat bled and did not notice the taste. Balon Greyjoy sat in his chair and listened to his brother with eyes that had made less sense to softer men. He counted ships. He counted suns. He moved stones on a sea-warped board. He whispered a name he had not said since his boy had been small, and the boy had not heard it then, either, because a wall of Winterfell had been between them. At Deepwood, Mot Asha returned with a band of men who had lost helmets to branches and temper to sap. She stood beneath the timbered gate whose braces had been set by men who did not know her name and called up to her brother without lowering her chin. "You fight like a man who has decided when he wants to die," she said.
Ido, Fien answered.
"Not now." She laughed, low and genuine, and he felt the sound at once as a blessing and a wound. "If you keep this hold," she said, "I will bring you ale enough to swim in it. If you lose it, I will bring you a knife for your heart." "Bring ale," Theon said. He wanted her to see he did not tremble, and he did not. She grinned again, turned on her heel, and went to cut throats for another day. The Blackwater steamed under a pale autumn sun. Char, fish, and victory mixed and made a smell no man wanted to name. Tyrion Lannister breathed it shallowly and did his sums. The sums were wrong because half the coin he counted had already been promised twice and the other half was owed to men with swords who did not care for ledgers. He wrote anyway, and he placed men where they would do, guard here, whip there, a kind word in a hard place, a hard word for a jester in silk. Under the charm and the bite, something old and dogged kept walking in him. Later he would call it duty. Now he called it stubbornness and poured watered wine on it so it would burn less. He was summoned to the throne room where Tywin gleamed like a coin in sunlight and where roses had been tied around columns that had not asked for garlands but could not push them off. Marjorie Tyrell stood at Joffrey's side with her hands folded as if holding a bird. She looked so much like spring pretending winter had never existed that Sansa felt for a moment like she might be allowed to fall asleep across her own arm without flinching. Joffrey announced what everyone expected him to announce, and those who did not expect it swallowed expectations before their faces could tell on them. Sansa sat very straight and prayed because it was work for the hands and the mouth while her heart went elsewhere. North, always north, to a godswood that had never had this city's smell. Later they told Tyrion what his father had decided. He was to wed a girl who had become the North in a dress. He had always been a man who made a joke at a noose, but when he heard the sentence his mouth filled with something the jokes could not speak around. He nodded because Tywin was looking at him and because one did not give that man the gift of a protest he could break. "As you command," he said lightly, and his father's eyes said he heard the lightness and liked it because it meant mastery. Sansa was told as girls are told such things, by an older woman who made her voice as kind as the news allowed and lowered it when it threatened to be wet. She curtsied because the floor was there and the habit of it ran to her bones. When she lifted her head, she found Tyrion across from her in a window embrasure with his hands folded and a look on his face that was almost apology and almost pride. "My lady," he said, and in those two words there was more courtesy than she had been given in months. "My lord," she returned, because words can be thrown back like ropes and sometimes they hold. He tried to make his mouth do what it had been hired for all his life. He found he could not jest her into comfort. "They make matches in my family like men make shoes," he said instead, rye gilding iron, stitched in the dark and worn to the bone. She looked at his scar and did not look away. "In mine," she said slowly, "they made cloaks that covered too." He bowed to the dignity in that. When he left her, he had not eased her. He had, perhaps, not made it worse. The wedding would be quick because Tywin liked his knots to be tied before the rope got old. Ser Mandon Moore had failed in his work, and nobody said it because saying it would require asking who had pulled on the other end of that rope. Tyrion's face bore the proof, and there were men who could not look at it even when he stood right there and offered it to them as an answer to their unasked questions. The day came. A septon spoke words that were not meant to be binding for children and cripples, and the unwilling and yet bound perfectly well when spoken in front of a king and a god's candles. Sansa walked as if she kept two men upright. Her father with one hand she did not hold, her new husband with the other hand that did not touch. When Tyrion had to stand on a book to cloak her and the courtiers tittered, Sansa felt a cold anger like a wind through her. She put her shoulders back and stepped toward him and saved him the reach. He met her halfway. It was not love and it was not comfort, but it was something that would stand in a wind for a while. In the feast after, Littlefinger floated like a paper boat that never got wet. He smiled at Sansa in a way that told her to remember her mother's hair and her own hair and the color those men liked when they thought of winter. Dantos Hollard came red-faced and whispered and spilled wine on his shoes and made a plan that had the shape of something that would fall apart and perhaps not, because sometimes drunk men plan the one sober deed of their lives. Varys moved like patience in silk and said nothing he meant aloud to anyone who mattered and everything he meant under the breath to the walls. Tyrion did not touch Sansa that night. He drank until he could be sure he would not, and to his disgust he found he needed less wine than he had guessed. In the morning he took down his cup with hands that did not shake and went to the small council and asked for coin to repair the river gate and men to clean the steps of the sept and measures to see that the baker's ovens would not go out for lack of wood. "You have a wife," Cersei said, as if that explained anything useful at all. "And you have a city," Tyrion said, as if that were the answer to everything. Stannis Baratheon sat on Dragonstone with his jaw clenched so long the muscle leapt in his cheek and made his face a lighthouse in a storm. Davos climbed up out of the sea toward him like a barnacle and stood dripping on the black stone and made his palms into fists and opened them again because he had not known before today that grief could make fists of hands a man had thought gentle once. "You burned your men for light and you melted your chances," he said, not worrying about the fact it could be his head for saying it. "Do not burn what is left of you for a god who asks for wood and a match and never gives you oil in return." Melisandre's mouth curved. "You will not see because you have put out your own eyes," she said, and the red in her dress had nothing of blood or wine in it today. It was the red of something that had decided to be red and would not change even for fire. Stannis stared at the window as if the sea might write him an apology. "I will have my right," he said. Not to Melisandre, nor to Davos, nor to any man listening. He said it to the air, which is faith in a shape men rarely name as such. Davos bowed his head because kings ask truth like a beggar asks alms and throw it away after. He would tell Stannis again tomorrow and the day after until the man heard or he did not. He would keep his bones about him for as long as he could so that somebody would be left to remember that truth had been spoken aloud where a sea had names and a stone had a throne. Ned reached White Harbor with the gulls crying over the masts and Lord Wyman in his chair like a mountain of goodwill, rings flashing and voice rolling. "Fish, my lord," he said, delighted. "Fish in kegs, fish in their own oil, fish in crates wrapped in plum leaves so they smell sweet when you open them. Flour not cut with chaff, salt in blocks that do not cry when you chip them, boats with bellies wide as lawyers' pockets. A merman to blow your war if you like it so." He laughed until he coughed and waved away a steward with a cloth. "I will feed the north if I have to swallow a kraken whole and belch up a net. I will bake bread for wolves and pack it in clean straw and swear by my mother's beard to get it to wherever you put your boot." Ned clasped his wrist and meant it when he said, "The Starks remember." He walked the docks with the old lord's son, saw ropes plaited and barrels pitched, saw boys with smut on their cheeks carry loaves as if they were swords. He put his hand to hulls and felt the thunk of carpenters' mallets and listened to the surf speak a language men had only ever learned by being thrown into it. By the time he boarded Seaguard's pier and sat with Jason Mallister over a chart weighted with old iron and fresh bread, he had an army made of bread and fish and rope and hands. "It will not sing," he said. "It will hold." Ravens came and went through it all like breath. One brought word that Lord Walder had accepted the bread and sent in return a list of cousins' names longer than he had grandchildren. One brought word from the Eyrie that Lisa had taken to her bed and would not be moved by petition or threat. One came from Deepwood, Theon's hands spare and braced. "Asha tests each night. We stand. Bring salt for meat and bandage for hands. Daisy says if the Kraken grows 2 more arms, she will take those 2. He smiled at that, a small nick of mouth that ached but did not break. He wrote, "Stand. Bread goes where swords cannot. Sing loud enough for Robb to hear you north of Harrenhal." When he put his seal to that and wished a raven good wing, he took the last letter he had been avoiding and broke it. "The stag and the wolf," it began, and then Stannis's handwriting remembered its shape and became harder. "I demand what is mine by law and by blood. The woman who sits with the boy on iron owns neither. If you are a man of the law as I have been told and a man of oath as I have heard, you will write your banners to mine and sign your name to justice." The word justice tasted like iron and snow, and for a damp heartbeat he wanted very much to give it what it asked. He read again until the candles wept and found in those strokes not only justice but the man who held it in two bleeding hands and could not decide whether to drink or to throw the cup. He sent no promise. He sent only truth. The North does not bend to a paper crown while lions gnash their teeth in river fields. Keep your ships on water that does not burn. When winter puts ice where wood floats, then we will speak of marching. Caitlin left Riverrun with Daisy Mormont and a fry boy who had a cowlick like a prayer and a letter tucked in his belt from his grandfather that listed curses and admonitions equal number. She rode as if she could catch a season between her hands and hold it and slow it. Behind her in the castle, Edmure counted barrels and discovered he knew more about grain than a lord ought. Brienne sat with a whetstone and put an edge on grief you could shave with and did not cut herself. Robb rode to the mills and watched walls go up where none had been and remembered Winterfell's yard in summer, when wood had been cheaper and time a thing boys owned. He lay in his tent one night with wet maps and gray light and thought of Jane Westerling's soft hands when she had bound a cut near his elbow and how he had wanted to lay his head down against any softness and stop. He sat up and put his hands flat on his knees and did not move until desire went cold. He slept without dream and woke colder and stronger and the same. Theon walked the palisade and met Asha at its foot again and learned the way her eyes changed when she had a new idea. She kept calling him boy out of habit and he kept not flinching out of practice. When a longship tried to force the channel at dusk with men crouched under planks like beetles under bark, Daisy let them come and then dropped a weighted net on their heads and the lot of them went down like a sack of hammers. "We fish for squid now," she bellowed, and laughed until men found themselves laughing too because it is hard not to when a Mormont woman crows. In King's Landing, Sansa found a sliver of kindness left in Septa Mordane's old book, the one she had thought lost in the first sack and found again on a shelf that had never been dusted. The page held a drawn maiden with a fearsome sword, taller than any man, facing a dragon with a look that said neither of us will be unmade today. She traced it with her forefinger and did not pray. She remembered. That night, Dantos met her behind a pillar with a cloak that smelled of mildew and a plan that smelled of wine. She nodded when he used the wrong names for doors and then went back to the small chamber that was hers and folded the cloak under her mattress anyway because sometimes men stumble into truth without meaning to and women are wise enough to keep the thing that might save them if it is brought to them. Tyrion went to his new wife with news about bread and coal and tariffs on wine that would make Southern lords sober for at least a month, and he told her because she deserved to be treated as if she knew about such things. She listened with hands in her lap and her head bent a little like a bud, and then she lifted her face and said, very quietly, "Thank you for not touching me." He bowed as if she had made him a lord. When he left, he made a joke to himself about virtue and how it tastes like porridge without salt, and he was disgusted with the joke enough to swear not to tell it to anyone. In the neck, Arya hunted plover eggs and did not break a one. She stacked them in a net bed with moss for pillow and brought them to the hearth with her chest full of the pride of small work done perfectly. Mira clapped her on both shoulders and called her ragged girl and royal, which made Arya laugh and swat at her and then sit very still because sometimes laughter bruises if you move too fast after. Jojen said, looking at the eggs as if they were stones, "A girl will leave on water and come back over snow." And Arya stuck out her tongue at prophecy and ate 2 eggs at once because she was hungry. Ned finished his work in the south. He had given himself and turned north again with a file of men who had learned how to keep bread dry on days when rain had crawled into everything else. He stopped at Seaguard and watched the booming tower call warning to the sea. He slept one night under Jason Mallister's roof and dreamed of Ben-Jen and woke with the bitter taste of Old Search in his mouth and the surety that the world owed him no answers. He reached Moat Cailin to find Arya a little taller and Mira pleased with something she would not say and Howland with a map made of water that could not be rolled or inked. He stood on the tower and breathed peat and rain and faint ash and one clean line of snow far north. He set his hand on the stone and it gave nothing back, and that, too, was comfort. Time moved. The crows at Harrenhal counted it with their own rasps. The phrase wrote once more, the words thicker, the flattery thinner, the insults a little more honest. Tywin's men passed over the Ruby Ford like a dark ribbon, and then pulled back and then went again, and Robb set traps made of rumors, and the lion's paws bled in places his eyes could not see. At Dragonstone, Stannis polished his anger and learned nothing from it except the shine of futility. Davos prayed and then went to the kitchen and made the cook stretch onions in a stew so that men would eat something that tasted the way truth tastes. Sharp, plain, and dear. In the White Knife's mouth, Wyman's ships moved in and out with their bellies proud, and in Dockside Alley a woman counted bread for her children, and then counted the holes she had made in each loaf to make it look like more, and she cried and then laughed and then did not do either, because hands must work. And when the wind turned one night and carried a wolf's howl to the very last reed at the edge of the last pool in the neck, Arya lifted her head and something in her uncoiled. Ned heard it too, and it pushed a fist gently against the place in his chest where grief had been sleeping. He put his palm there and felt a pulse that was not only his own. He leaned back into the darkness and closed his eyes and knew, as surely as a man knows when winter has done with him and means to go ride someone else for a change, that the pack still ran. He could not say where all its feet fell. He did not need to. He would keep the road under them. He would keep the fire banked until the night had spent itself and men remembered how to use their eyes again. He rose before dawn and limped to the parapet. The marsh lay like black glass out to the first pale stitch of day. A lone bird cut it and left a line in the surface that closed behind her as if she had never flown. He thought of Sansa's ring of flowers around a heart he could not touch, and of Robb's sword where it had fallen for a moment from his hand when he thought no one saw, and of Theon's jaw set against the taste of shame, and of Catelyn's letter that had only said the one thing that counts, come home, and of a boy in black on a wall of ice looking north. He said the names again, and then he stopped and named himself because he would need that too. The dawn took his breath and gave it back. He turned toward the stair, and the day began.